I hope you know who you are, 'cause you're listening to the Michael Harding podcast. And we've just passed the equinox, the spring equinox. We're into that half of the year where there's more light in the sky in Ireland than there is darkness. It's always a lovely turning of the year, and then tomorrow night the clocks go forward. Suddenly it's bright until 8 o'clock in the evening. And you think, what a wonderful country to be living in. You know, you mightn't have the sun's heat every day of the week, but you do have the sun's light. I'm going to read from a book I wrote during the lockdown. This is part 3 of What is Beautiful in the Sky. And if you missed the other episodes, they're marked as, part 1 and part 2. This one is part 3. So you could, if you like, go back and listen to them all in sequence. Or you could choose to just listen where you are. Lying in bed, sitting on the sofa, scratching around in the kitchen, or walking on the beautiful beaches of California, Africa, the west coast of France, or maybe up in the cold waters of Scandinavia. And maybe you're just here, like me, in Ireland. I'm in Donegal today. I move between the two places, as you'll notice if you're regular listeners. Sometimes I do be in Leitrim, in the hills above Loch Allen, and sometimes I do be here in my little studio on the west coast of Donegal, the place where I wrote a book last year, a book called All the Things Left Unsaid. At the moment I'm also moving around the country because I'm on tour. This coming Saturday night I'm on Grianon in Letterkenny. And next week, on the last day in March and the first day in April, I'll be in the Pavilion Theatre in Dunleary. Just in case. I'd say there's a few tickets left, but I'm so delighted to say that the tour so far has been booking out really. Apart from a couple of, half a dozen seats in each venue. So it's going really well. And I thought today that I would, as I say, continue another section of a book I wrote 3 years ago, What is Beautiful in the Sky. Because this podcast does 3 things. One thing I do is I talk with enthusiasm about my Christian faith. And I talk with enthusiasm about Islamic faith because I feel very close. I'm on the threshold, if you like. There is no great theological barrier from me embracing the beautiful richness of Islam. And to be honest, I've never come across more poetic and eloquent meditations on the nature of being than I've got from Islam. There's a great writer, a current writer, her name is A. Helwa, Helwa, and she writes beautiful, beautiful books. And then, of course, there's Rumi. The most popular published poet in America, even to this day, is Rumi, the great Persian poet. And his poetic insights into Islam are absolutely glorious. And I love him. So that's one thing I do. And I think it sometimes, it kind of corresponds to a normal way that we live. There are days when we're up. There are days when we're enthusiastic. There are days when we're in good form about everything. And that's when I'm in good form about faith and when I'm affirmative about the beauty and the poetry of religious faith. Now, there are other days where I'm bewildered. It's like the faith is a full tide and it goes out and I'm empty. And I think that corresponds to our normal way of life as well. Normally, we will go through days where we're high, where we're so enthusiastic about life, and then the following day we might wake up and everything is black and bleak. I'm not just talking about somebody who suffers from depression. I suffered from depression. 10 years ago, I went through a very bad period. And I think I got out of it. I mean, I'm 10 years out of it. And it's no accident, I suppose, that I use religious faith as a kind of therapy. I can stand outside me, the religious person, and I can say to myself, well, I know why I'm doing this. It's because, as a psychotherapy, it protects me from some kind of bleakness or emotional darkness that can overwhelm any of us. So that's the second thing I do in podcasts. I try and share that sense of devastation, that sense of emptiness, that sense of, my God, why have you abandoned me? I always like talking about it when it comes to this time of year because we're coming close to Easter. And coming close to Easter means we're coming close to all the narratives about the crucifixion. And we live in a world where you don't really need the Christian Gospels to inhabit devastation because the narratives of darkness and devastation and suffering are all around us, globally in the world, politically, in famines, and even in the sense of where the whole globe is going in relation to global warming or wars or dictators or ideologies or whatever you want yourself, you name it. I mean, it's all out there, all the darkness. But in some way, it's not that the story of the Christian gospel competes with history. It's more that the Christian gospel can give you a sort of a lens through which to understand history. It can allow you to stand in a space of darkness with a firm conviction that God does not abandon us. So there's two ways, I suppose, where I talk from a space of joy and affirmation, and there's other days I talk from a space of sadness and emptiness and devastation. And I never know which one is coming at me because they come in waves. And then in the middle of those, what I call the halfway stage is the equanimity that I find in Buddhist practice and in Buddhist ideas. That can be a really, really interesting space to explore. Where you're saying to yourself that you're not completely possessed by positivity. You're not kind of really swinging out of the rafters with your religion. And yet you're not at the same time in some black hole of depression or sadness. The place to be sometimes is in between. And that in-between space is a kind of a world where you can find great consolation, and the way into it, the way to keep steady in it, is through thinking in terms of Buddhist ideas and Buddhist practice. Now, I share those three things with you. Those three senses, ways of being in the world. One is high and one is low and one is in between. And the one where I'm high, I find it easy to share religious ideas, and when I'm really low, I find that the religious ideas are very useful to me, that keep me that keep me kind of alive within moments of despair. And they're the way that religion works. They give us joy and ecstasy at one level, and at the other extreme level, they give us a sense of something to hold on to in the darkest night. And the one in between, there's the amazing wise one, the halfway stage, where you begin to understand the subtlety of, I suppose, the Buddhist view. You might ask me what the Buddhist view is in this regard. Well, it's something that I have done podcasts on, and again, if you go back through what is now about 300 podcasts, you will find subjects to do with Tibetan Buddhism. And I think you'll find there, even if you're not into, you don't have to be into Buddhism as a religion. Buddhism is much more a kind of a psychotherapy or a philosophy. And if you go there into those podcasts, search around on the site for previous ones I did, you'll see what I mean by having a middle view, a view that says, I express my faith, but I know that all I'm doing is expressing my faith. It's neither absolutely true, nor is it absolutely false. And when I say that the mountain is blue and it is beautiful and I will walk upon the mountain today, I know that that is not absolutely true. I know that that perception is not absolutely true, but I also know that it's not false. In some sense, reality becomes more strongly real to us the more we perform reality. The more we practice reality, it becomes real. And that's again where I suppose, religious faith makes sense, because I'm not a compassionate person, but if I practice compassion, I am a compassionate person. And even if I was being compassionate to some dear friend, if I said to myself, yes, I'm now a compassionate person, that would be wrong, because I'm not. I'm only compassionate insofar as I express or perform this gesture of compassion. So that Buddhist view probably for me is the synthesis, it's what holds all other extremes together. And it allows me, it's the Buddhist foundation that allows me to enjoy my Christian heritage. It allows me to enjoy the absolutely wonderfully beautiful poetry of Islam and Judaism. I can belong to these spaces of devotional insight and perception because I have this foundation from Buddha that says, well, these things are true as far as they go, but they're not absolutely true. They're true insofar as you practice it. Now, that would be all that I want to share with you today from a point of view of ideas. And what I'd love to do now is get on to what I said I would do, and that's reading from a book. It's part 3 of What is Beautiful in the Sky. And I hope you like it. In Mullingar, the autumns arrived, one after another, each one more swift than the previous, dry and still, and the leaves around the big house in Shandona fell one by one, as I stood admiring autumn colours in the oak trees, with winter folding itself around me. The General's robust bounce was faltering even then, and he no longer strode about with the haughty flamboyance of a turkey-cock on the dung-heap that he once did in his 50s. The recession deepened its fingerprint in his bank books, and he never quite recovered, and the gloom of a threadbare future gathered in his face, and he sat in a large, empty drawing room. "Why don't you light a fire?" I asked him one time, but he couldn't be persuaded. "It's been a while since I sat at a good fire," he confessed. "I'm trying to avoid using fuel until November." We watched a Japanese movie that night, a slow-moving black and white meditation on the ordinariness of family life by Yasujiro Ozu, though it only made the general more miserable. In the film, a daughter asks her father, was he in love when he married? "At first we were not in love," the father replied tenderly. The general sighed in his armchair. "But love grows in time," the Japanese man said. "It takes 10 years to create this flower of love." "Bloody rubbish," the general grunted. "Fathers were not like that in the 50s, at least not in Ireland." He stared into the empty fire grate for a long time, and when he spoke again it was in a whisper. "When I was 16, my father asked me was I gay. Of course he didn't say gay back in those days. He had another word for it. Basically, I wasn't manly enough, and I think it was from that point onwards that I began to act more manly. And I joined the army, and I don't know my feelings. It's as if I wear a mask all the time. But as I get older, I realize that the only thing left inside me is the ghost of a boy who never lived." During the lockdown, I often think of nursing homes and the splendid love and care my mother got in Newbrook and Mullingar. And I'm ashamed to say that sometimes I'm glad she died 7 years ago and never knew the fears of living in a nursing home during the virus. Her generation had come through enough hard times without needing to be terrorized as they died. I remember one time talking to a man in Delvin whose father fought in the First World War. "My father was gassed in the trench," he said. "For years afterwards he suffered severe nosebleeds. One day when I was 5 he fell in the yard and other men ran to him and there was blood everywhere. They were plugging his nose in an attempt to stop the bleeding. It was like a scene from a battle. They took him to Mullingar Hospital where he died." "Was it a big funeral?" I wondered. "I don't know," he said, "because they never told me he was dead. In those days people thought it was better not to tell children anything." A few weeks afterwards, the little boy was in the yard with his mother as she hung clothes on the line, and out of the blue the boy said, "Mammy, why do we never wash Daddy's shirts any more?" She broke down in tears and told him that his father was dead and that she was sorry for having kept it a secret from him. And they were proud back then in the long ago. I recall another old woman telling me it was pride killed her husband. How so, I wondered. "Well," she said, "he went into hospital with a septic finger. It was just a bit of straw that had cut him, and it went bad. But he wouldn't stay in hospital. He insisted on coming home, and then it got worse, and he died. There was no point trying to talk to him." But there is an anonymity about nursing homes, a kind of grey wall behind which the unresolved lives of elders can be managed without their histories troubling anyone else. And one of the terribly mistaken presumptions that young people make is that by the time a person gets to 70, they have resolved their life. Now, when I went to visit the General, he was a cardigan of bones in my arms. except that I might not see him again. I might never see him again if he was one of the unlucky ones during the virus's dark reach into the lives of the elderly. Older people have their dreams and heartaches too, their anxieties and despair. They are so confused, as the rest of the world, about what is real or unreal and where heaven might be, or if it doesn't exist. And then why did anyone invent it? When summer came to Mullingar, the General was always at my side. I remember lighting the first barbecue of the year on a Saturday evening under the chestnut trees. The horses watched us from the field where the barley was harvested the previous year. After the barley was gone, the pigeons feasted on the roadside for a few days, from what spilled off the trucks, and the barley fermented in their gullets and made them drunk, so they couldn't fly home, and a lot of them met their death under the wheels of oncoming traffic. At the barbecue, 2 musicians sipped beer before they began to play. The fiddle and the accordion were still in their boxes, leaning against a stone wall. The accordion player was unshaven and wore a greasy cap, while the fiddle player was tall and dark with joined eyebrows. They smoked leisurely and discussed what age Mrs. Hughes was when she died the previous week. I think she was nearly 90, the old accordion player said. Bridie Hughes played accordion in the Dinny Hughes band many years ago. In the early days, she and Dinny cycled to the venues, him on the saddle and Mrs. Hughes, sometimes pregnant, on the carrier seat, with an accordion strapped to her back. She was playing the piano in the house up to a few weeks ago, the fiddle player remarked. She was fond of bingo too, the accordion man added. Then they went over to the wall and tuned the instruments, and everyone gathered around the smoke, the plucked sausages from the grill. There were fillets of steak for important people and slices of shark for the vegetarian nurse, and teenagers grabbed the burgers and everyone spilled salad dressing on their skirts and frocks and blouses and pants. "Where are you from?" the fiddler asked. "Arigna," I said, "but I was born in Cavan. In truth, I don't know where I'm from. I'm reasonably at home in Mullingar." "Arigna," the greasy-capped accordion player remarked. "Arigna's a lovely spot for music. Isn't O'Carolan buried somewhere up there?" "He lies in Ballyfarnan," I said, "beside the lake." When O'Carolan was dying, he made a final journey around the places he loved, calling at some of the houses he had filled with music over the years. At last he came to Mrs. MacDermot Rowe's door in Ballyfarnan. "I have come home to die," he declared. MacDermot Rowe had cherished him as a child, and he now returned like a salmon, just in time to compose a farewell to music and to be buried in the land he loved. He wasn't the only artist who loved the place he was born. Liam O'Flaherty returned to Arran in old age and kicked a big rock, saying, "Ahniam ho," an Irish phrase that singularly expresses the mindfulness of one person towards another person. He was addressing the rock as a soul friend. In comparison to the wounded hills of Leitrim, the streets of Mullingar were unnaturally jolly, and closer to Krakow than ancient Ireland. But after a few years I could feel a lovely tug when I walked up the hill of Ishnok or listened for ghosts whispering in the names of places, Kilbeggan, Kinnegad, Ballinacarraghy, unimportant villages in the sweep of history, but as places to call home, they are no less beautiful than anywhere else. The great novelist Kazantzakis was born in a village in Crete, where he played under the olive trees and watched cherries burst with juice in dark wooden buckets of brown water. And when he left home he carried a handful of clay in his pocket, just like people of Tory Island in Donegal do, carry the clay of their island to the ends of the world. I once thought that Ireland might have buried its soul in cement on the day the motorway was laid through the Screen Valley between the ancient hills of Tara. Certainly some villages in Westmeath were almost buried in cement when the Celtic tiger was leaping around in the first decade of the 21st century, but by 2010 the young people at the barbecues across Ireland didn't care about Tara or cement or new houses, and they did an enormous amount of hugging and kissing because a few of them were heading for Australia on the morrow. History had swallowed them up. Not just the boom, which vanished into air and which people could cope with, but hugging and kissing and all that spontaneity that made us human has gone. And its loss changes us, and has changed us so much that even now, only 10 years after the time of the barbecues, it feels like another country, as the past always is, though it lingers, the beauty of it. My lovely general in his stride, as he raised his brandy glass to the young people and sang for them, "Landlord, fill the flowing cup." Whether they liked it or not, he sang it. As the evening closed in, the old people dissolved into the shadows. The musicians put away their instruments, and the young ones on the patio set up amplifiers and monitors and got ready to dance the night away. I suppose beauty is what we reach for, but never find. In our little destinies it eludes us, or we are simply overtaken by age and time. But I like to look for something beautiful in a story, because finding beauty or shaping the story around what is beautiful is always possible, or at least was possible before the virus came. I'm always haunted by that image of the old monk in the boat, pointing at something beautiful in the sky with his finger, and the young monk in attendance, following the discretion of that finger and opening his gaze and feeling the kiss of moonlight on his skin. And in the current mess of global chaos and the ugly face of chronic lung disease, it's not so easy to find. And it would be a disservice to the general to suggest that he is still out there somewhere huffing and puffing with an inflated ego, or swaggering around the streets of Mullingar. He is old, and he misses the touch of humans he's so long denied. The wife he abandoned, the children whose birthdays he so often forgot, don't come to call on the old cocoon, so he is alone and in need. He calls me, and I don't even return his calls, because I can't see that it would do any good. I fail him every day. So he cries in his nursing home, rubbing red eyes with the edge of his blanket, and I cannot pretend it is otherwise. I sit upright for a moment and become mindful, scanning my body with awareness, scanning the room with awareness. It's going to be a good day. I will enjoy it even if I have to force myself. So I sit at the desk for a few moments, looking into the garden and enjoying the music of the birds outside as the sun rises higher over the mountain. Well, Lord blesses. I'm going to leave it at that because I think that's a nice, tidy and complete picture of the general when he was in the nursing home. Now, you may know that I write stories that try to be or live as metaphor for some sort of mood or condition that we inhabit. And when the lockdown was at its fullest, it was spring, it was this time of year, and the weather was absolutely beautiful, and I was in a beautiful place in the hills above Loch Allen, but nonetheless, everyone was gripped by a sense of fear and sadness, and I think the shortness of life in the face of illness. And that's when I wrote that, because in those moments of sadness, those are times where you need to perform your joy. You need to externalize your joy. And the magical thing is that when you externalize the joy, you become joyful. You perform the self that you then become to some extent. Now, I am so glad that you are here, and I'll continue the story, What is Beautiful in the Sky, next week. Thank you for being here. Bye-bye.